before I begin the talk that I actually planned to give, I want to remind you who you are. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. If you could strip away the natural world and see in the spiritual realm, you would see that you are filled with light and you are holy warriors. Every one of you. There's power in you. Not your power, not your strength. But there's power in you, and you don't even know how much. The power that created the universe is in you. And Jesus has himself given you authority and power to use it to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. Not just an idea or to try to sell it, but to demonstrate it. All around us now, darkness is rising. In almost every arena, wherever you look, darkness is rising. But whenever that happens, God raises up a move that will change that. There's always a counter. You are part of that counter. You were appointed for this time and this place. The place you're from, the places you will go. You were appointed for this from before the foundation of the world. And the Lord has promised that he will be with you. He'll be with you. When you walk out of here, he's with you. When you go home, he's with you. Never, ever doubt in the darkness what you've seen in the light. God has touched you, healed you, encouraged you, empowered you, taught you. Never doubt. There's tough times, of course. But the light always shines brightest in the darkness. The church is going into exile, a time of exile, but great things happen in exile. And you are those people. And the power is real, and it's in you. And I just want to challenge you, use it. Use it. Use your authority. Open your eyes to the schemes of the evil one and destroy his schemes. Jesus gave you authority and power over all the power of the evil one. He cannot resist you if you will stand. And You and your people have been tormented and attacked in mind and body. But you can fight back and win. And I really felt like I should say this. I don't know. I don't know how to say this in a way that, can kind of be in some kind of proportion, but my entire experience is that God has had his hand on the Vineyard movement in a very special way. I don't want to say that God isn't working in other places. He is, and I'm often in the other places. The Vineyard is not the only movement that I end up ministering in. Yet, there's still something unique. First of all, nobody else has the same theology. But there's also just this presence of God and his power, and this experience that we have, this reality that we have of just how physical that just is hard to find anywhere else. And I think it's very much needed right now, in this time, in this place. And, we're in a time where the torch is being passed from the first generation to the next generations. That's you. And so, don't let the difficulties keep you from doing what God's called you to do. Yeah, that's all. I just felt like the presence of the Lord so strong in that we needed to remember who we were. Okay, so what I'm supposed to teach about right now is 7 obstacles to growing in ministry. The kind of most common things I've seen over the years that keep people from growing in ministry and becoming all the things that God would want to do in terms of using them in ministry. And I'll just go through them and talk about them a little bit. The first one is false humility. The essence of false humility is try to diminish or play down or hold back or hesitate in the use of the gifts that God has given you in the name of humility. Well, I don't want to be prideful. And a lot of times it's a real struggle. I wrestled with this for a good 5 years. God was speaking very clearly, but I felt that it was ridiculously prideful to even think or even say out loud that call because it was so much bigger than I was. I couldn't do it in my strength. But when I said yes and said it out loud, it all started happening. God has called us to live lives beyond human explanation. That's how he gets glory. If your life can be explained by you and your strength and your hard work and your smarts and your persistence and a few good books, how does God get glory from that? But when God uses you to do things that patently, clearly, couldn't be from you, they're just so far beyond you that it's not even hardly worth talking about, then God gets a lot of glory. And he loves to take improbable, messed up people and do great things with them. False humility leads us to, frankly, to just pure disobedience. And the answer to pride is not false humility. The answer to pride is this: use your gifts for all you're worth. Go for it full bore. Don't hold back. Don't apologize. Don't minimize. Just go and do it. And at the same time, Just be super transparent about your weaknesses and your mistakes. You get that? That's the essence of humility. Be willing to serve and be honest about your mistakes and your weaknesses. So the Apostle Paul says flat out in front of us and for all of us to read for ourselves about being caught up to the third heaven, not even sure if he's in his body anymore, but says, as a result of that, I will glory in my weaknesses all the more. And goes on and talks about how he was a murderer and a blasphemer and so forth. Puts it all right out there, and that's how we do it. We celebrate the works of God in our life, and we pursue the callings for all we worth without hesitation, because it's not about us and it's not about our strength. And we just are honest about our mistakes and weaknesses along the way. 2, the second thing that causes people not to grow and reach is the fear of the opinion of others. Like, oh gosh, 1985, 1986, God was mostly working on me. And generally, I was the guy down front, flopping and yelling and making a lot of noise and getting worked over from one end to the other. And, very early on, there was 3.5 hours of fire, and it was God burning out the fear of what people thought. And he really intensely hated it. I think that, the way you deal with the fear of other people's opinions is get a bigger fear. Yeah? Like, I got a bigger fear. I almost died in that fire. Like, if God had, turned that notch just a little further, I would have stopped breathing. Because it was a struggle to breathe, I'll tell you. And, so I got a bigger fear, disappointing him. So, honestly, I don't care what you guys think, in a certain way. Because I'm just looking at him. What does he think? So get a bigger fear. 3, big thing that holds people back, perfectionism. Now, this thing is really tricky because it portrays itself as faithfulness. So a couple of comments. Number 1, I want to tell you, after trying for 45 years, the perfect Sunday is never coming. It's never coming. There's always going to be some volunteers that don't show up. There's always going to be a couple people who don't get along. There's always going to be a machine that breaks down. There's always going to be a computer that worked just fine 5 minutes before. You laugh because it's happened to you, hasn't it? It was all set up. The video was fine 5 minutes ago, but can they get it going now? No. There's always going to be something like that. And you know what? None of it matters. None of it matters. Ultimately, your fruitfulness, your impact in the world, it does not come by trying to do everything right. It comes by doing the right things. And those are not the same thing at all. The right things are pretty basic. Pray without ceasing. Preach the gospel. Teach people. Pray for people. Be with them. Repeat. It's the right things. Serve the poor, fight for the powerless. Those are the right things. Do the right things. And God will bless you. And it really doesn't matter if the computer doesn't work. We had some Sundays, where the electric power was completely off. And we were in an auditorium with no lights. It'd be like being in here with no electrics. It would be pitch dark, and we just sang in the dark, a cappella. And God still came. So, and the odd thing about perfectionism is that perfectionism never leads to perfection. In fact, it goes in the opposite direction. Perfectionism becomes destructive and makes things worse than they would have been otherwise. I'll tell you how that happens. Perfectionism leads to overwork. You end up, in your own strength and effort, doing things beyond what you should do. Working too many hours, wearing yourself out, and doing things that Jesus isn't really giving you grace for. Overwork makes you tired and cranky, which leads to conflict with your people, which leads to anger, which eventually leads to bitterness. And that opens you up to the enemy. We once watched a church planter who could not let go of his perfectionism go from the most promising church planter to coming to the point where he could not get out of bed. And still not having learned his lesson, came back and tried to do it again, and his church and trustees and everybody there rose up together and fired him because he was a pain in the butt to live with, because things were never perfect and he was always angry. Don't be that guy. And if you struggle with perfectionism, the answer is submission. Because perfectionism is a manifestation of the idolatry of trying to be our own God. All right, number 4, failing to get regular advice. Like, if you're going to be a leader, you need advice. The phones work still. Email still works, I think. You have various means. We've got all kinds of means of communication. Get advice. Ask questions. I've never seen anybody in ministry ultimately fail if they would take advice. So get regular advice. Get input when you're making decisions, when you need to grow, when it feels like things are getting frustrating. Call people up. You'll find out that probably everybody else has gone through the same thing at one point in their life, and I'm more than happy to help you. I always tell our church planners, we've had 2 kinds of church planners, the ones who got advice and the ones who wouldn't get advice. The ones who wouldn't get advice, nearly all of them failed. The ones who took advice, nearly none of them failed. So take your pick. 5, lack of focus and commitment. This is a particular challenge for younger people these days who are afraid of giving up any possible open doors, wanting to keep all options open. Always thinking, well, maybe there's another opportunity. And so very easily distracted. And a lot of the people in our churches these days are also in the same place where they're very easily distracted. It doesn't take very much of this, that, or the other thing to come up to cause them to, miss the opportunities. To grow in ministry, you do have to have focus, and you have to eliminate certain possibilities from your life so that you can actually build something that will last. So if God has called you, make a commitment to that and stay focused on it and do whatever it takes to do that thing. And don't worry about anything else. Very similar to that, number 6, avoiding making life choices. A lot of times people are afraid of missing God's will. And I just want to say, it's really hard to miss God's will. Almost impossible to miss God's will by accident. My experience is if I start missing God's will in the slightest bit, he sends 15 prophets to knock me back in place. Or my wife. That's kind of a shortcut. Just, get me back where I belong. So, it's hard to miss God's will by accident. In fact, it's really hard to miss God's will on purpose. Ask Jonah. Some of you may try to miss God's will on purpose, but he will get you. And he can play hardball. I got a good friend. He's now leading a Vineyard church in Oklahoma City in America. And we're pretty close. But about 15 years ago, he was running away from God. Or at least running away from the call. And so he went to San Francisco and started a shoe store, ostensibly to be evangelistic. I don't think anybody got saved in the shoe store, just between us. But eventually, God let him make a lot of money in the shoe store for a few years, and then God said, okay, time's up. You can either do my call, or I can curse your shoe store. That's what God said to him. And he dillied a little bit, and so God did curse his shoe store. And the thing that was making tons of money suddenly was bankrupt in 6 months. So, how do you want to play this? You don't want to give up the lucrative job? Well, God can take care of that. Whatever it is, that you're kind of worried about, like that. I suggest, early surrender is really the best policy. Really the best policy. You'll be much happier. Your family will be in much better shape, and you won't have to move so many times. All right, the last thing. When are we supposed to end anyway? Are we supposed to end at 3? I don't know. All right, we'll just play it. Last thing, and this is actually one of the most important, and this is something I feel very strongly about right now, is prayerlessness. We just don't pray enough. We're not praying enough. Look, we're entering into a time of very intense battle. And some of you are aware of this to some degree. Very intense battle. God's sending us into action. He's preparing all kinds of great things to happen. I mean, the Spirit is moving. He's rumbling around the world. It's sort of like there's these low rumbles everywhere, like something's coming, something's coming. It's like the volcano's getting ready to blow. But we got to get some prayer going to meet the challenge. If you don't have a prayer meeting in the church, get one started. And the thing about the prayer meetings is the success of the prayer meeting is not determined by how many people are in the prayer meeting. It's determined by what happens to the people who are in the prayer meeting. So it might only be 3 people, but if they meet with God, it will be a success. Does that make sense? Yeah, we need the prayer meeting. God's been anointing people for intercession for the last 20 years. It's time for the intercessors to get down to business now. You know what I mean? You know this thing? That's intercession. God's like releasing intercession in people, and they're supposed to pray. Well, it's time to pray and stop jerking. And part related to that is just not waiting on the Lord. And we've talked about this already this week quite a bit. Like, you got to wait. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord. Learn how to sail instead of rowing. I meet lots of pastors, and they say, I'm tired. And you know what I immediately think? You've been rowing. You've been trying to make this thing happen. And my advice is just stop. Stop that. Like, at this point in my life, I don't try to make anything happen. I just try to respond to what God is already making happen. And that's enough to keep me busy in retirement 12 months a year. Just about. Well, I get usually Christmas time off. Nobody wants to do Holy Spirit meetings in Christmas. But otherwise, I'm keeping busy. So you learn to sail. See what God is doing and follow that. You won't get tired. If you don't have to make everything happen, you won't get tired. You know, having trouble filling the rotas, pray. I've probably had 50 times in my life, at least 50 times. My children's pastor, and I've had 3 different ones, comes into my office. We can't fill the rotas. We need more volunteers. Can you make an announcement? And I've said, well, have you prayed for God to fill the rotas? Well, not exactly. Well, then don't be coming in here and asking me to make an announcement when you haven't even asked God. Get back to your cubicle and get on your knees and talk to me in 3 days. And I mean, like, every time they come back in 3 days, it's like, you wouldn't believe it. Yesterday, I got 10 phone calls from people out of the blue saying, I feel led by God to sign up for the rota. I said, see? So pray. Pray for everything. Pray for everything. Pray for everything. And God will do the work.